Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This is Chairman Rodney Hood. I call this December 2020 budget briefing of the Ncua Board to order. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this briefing is being conducted via teleconference. I'd like to thank our Office of the Chief Information Officer for making today's proceedings possible. Before we begin, I'd certainly like to say that I hope that all of you and your families had a wonderful Thanksgiving. It's in the spirit of Thanksgiving that I would like to at this time acknowledge the board service of J. Mark Mcwaters. I hope that you join me in thanking him for his 6+ years of dedicated service to Ncua. It was his legal brilliance and accounting expertise that really provided him with the strength and capabilities to really leave an indelible mark both at Ncua and in the credit union system. His sagacity will be greatly missed here at the Ncua. I'd also like to acknowledge his confidential and policy advisor, Sarah Vega, for her dedication to Ncua, having served numerous chairmen in her 12 years here at the agency, and also Katie Supples, who also provided them with great administrative support. The whole office of Mcwaters and Sarah Vega and Katie, we wish you well and thank you again for your dedicated service. Sadly, amid the pandemic, it's been difficult to have a farewell celebration worthy of a former chairman. I hope that in the days ahead we will be able to gather and celebrate the accomplishments of J. Mark Mcwaters. But again, thank you, sir, for your dedicated service. I'd now like to call on Board Member Harper just to quickly to see if he has any comments regarding Mark Mcwaters before we move on with our budget briefing today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have a few words that I'd like to say about our fellow colleague, Mark Mcwaters. During his 6 years on the Ncua board, Mark's intellect, independence, and insights improved the policy-making process. Mark approached this job with diligence and attention to detail that you would expect of an accomplished academic, certified accountant, and lawyer. His many achievements include strengthening the transparency of the voluntary merger process, closing the temporary corporate credit union stabilization fund ahead of schedule, and increasing the normal operating level of the share insurance fund. Mark leaves the board with a commendable record of success. Mr. Chairman, as you noted, behind every successful leader is a great team, so I must recognize the contributions of Sarah Vega, who served as a senior policy advisor longer than anyone else in the agency's history, and Katie Supples, Mark's executive assistant, who spent more than 12 years at the Ncua. As you noted, both recently departed the agency, and I wish them well in their endeavors. Once it becomes safe to travel again, I look forward to meeting in person with all three and the entire Ncua team to recognize the many accomplishments of Mark, Sarah, and Katie over the years. And as the Senate is scheduled to vote on Kyle Hoffman's nomination later today, I look forward to welcoming him to the Ncua board in the near future. His professional insights and professional experiences will bring a fresh perspective to the agency's operations, rulemakings, and priorities. Not long ago, the Ncua board was predominated by people with the last names starting in the letter M, as in Matt, Metzger, and Mcwaters. It now appears the agency's new favorite letter of a last name of the board member is H, as in Hood, Harper, and Hoffman. I think, therefore, that we three were destined to work together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further comments.
Thank you, Mr. Harper, and I would just acknowledge that Mr. Hoffman's vote today will be occurring at 11:45 a.m. Eastern, so thank you. This morning, everyone, we're meeting to hold a public briefing on a proposed budget for calendar year 2022. After opening statements by the board members, the 2021-2022 budget will be presented by Chief Financial Officer Eugene Sheed. Following Eugene's presentation, we will have a three-person panel of stakeholders offering their comments on the proposed Ncua budget. The panel would consist of three trade association representatives: Mike Schink from the Credit Union National Association, Kurt Long, National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions, and Lucy Ito, National Association of State Credit Union Supervisors. Each member of the panel will have up to 15 minutes to present. Additionally, I should note that the written comments from CUNA, NAFQ, and NASCUS are included as part of the administrative record. As I said in my initial briefing last year, I believe that consideration of the agency's budget is one of the most important responsibilities that we as the Ncua Board are charged by Congress to administer. The budget sets forth not only how we plan to spend money on expenses related to the operations of Ncua, but also how we align resources in support of our important mission of safety and soundness. It is important to note that Ncua's commitment to stewardship does not end with the adoption of the budget, but continues with how we actually spend the funds we collect. We must at all times be mindful and cognizant that the funds the Ncua receives are not ours, but are indeed those of the credit unions we oversee. I should note for the record that the Ncua publishes a very detailed description of its planned budget and other financial documents on our website. Transparency of the Ncua budget process, including the opportunity for direct public comment from stakeholders to the board that decides the budget, is unique for the Ncua among other financial regulators. Pursuant to the Federal Credit Union Act, final decisions on the Ncua budget are vested with the board. We take all public comments seriously and under advisement before making a final decision. I want to thank all of the participants for being part of this process. Now I'd like to give an opportunity to Board Member Harper to make opening comments about today. Mr. Harper, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Eugene, and the rest of the team in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer for your considerable efforts in preparing the proposed budget for 2021 and 2022. As I mentioned at last month's board meeting, the draft budget concerns me, especially in light of the safety and soundness implications that the credit union system may soon face because of the pandemic's economic fallout, the priorities of the agency related to consumer financial protection, and the general transparency of the Ncua budget. A budget is a forward-looking document that establishes priorities. Regarding the pandemic's economic effects, I believe that we should plan for the worst and hope for the best. Accordingly, we should provide the anticipated resources at the start of the year instead of potentially scrambling later to catch up. We already know that credit unions with higher risk profiles will require additional examiner attention and closer supervision next year as the economic effects of the pandemic unfold. Why, therefore, have we not engaged in a comprehensive discussion about the exam program to address this reality? During prior economic downturns, like the 2008 financial crisis, the Ncua returned to a 12-month examination cycle. We also increased our field resources to handle safety and soundness problems at federally insured credit unions. Our sister agencies did the same. In planning for the year ahead, I suspect our sister agencies may well increase their resources once again. If they do, we will look penny wise and pound foolish, especially if the ultimate economic impact of this pandemic hits the credit union system hard. Think of it this way. If you knew a year in advance of the Great Chicago Fire that would occur, would you flatline the number of firefighters in the budget? Of course not. Why have we kept constant the number of examiners next year? As I learned as a scout, we need to be prepared. That means always being ready to do your duty. We have a duty to the credit union members and taxpayers to protect the Share Insurance Fund and the credit union system. We have a duty to prepare for any economic fallout. We cannot just call on examiners from the state supervisors or other banking agencies to help us. They will be preoccupied with handling their own problem institutions. That is why I think we should plan ahead and budget for adequate field staffing needs now. Instead, this draft budget will spend just $175 per $1 million of system assets. Before the last crisis, that figure bottomed out at $210 per $1 million in industry assets. That cutting into the fat actually cut into the bone and left the agency flat-footed and ill-prepared for the financial crisis. We should not repeat that mistake. Additionally, we know that the NCOA falls short when it comes to the agency's oversight of consumer financial protection laws. Consumers, regardless of their financial provider of choice, deserve to have the same level of financial protection, yet we do not adequately assess consumer compliance management systems or even basic compliance with consumer financial protection laws in most credit unions. We also do not assign a separate consumer compliance rating in the way that other federal banking regulators do, and even some state supervisory entities do within the credit union system. What is more, the credit union system has continued to grow and become more complex. We have 40 additional consumer credit unions holding in excess of $1 billion in assets than we did just 1 year ago. Better safeguard consumers' interests and ensure the credit union system lives up to its commitment to serving members, we need to provide the resources to create an effective, dedicated program for supervising compliance with consumer financial protection laws. Our efforts will ensure better consumer financial protection for credit union members and decrease the likelihood of reputational risk within the system. To build an effective consumer compliance supervisory program, we need to do more than what the 2021 draft budget envisions. Adding just one person next year to develop a tiered examination procedures up to and including FFIEC improved examination procedures, lead consumer financial protection compliance reviews conducted at credit unions with higher compliance risk profiles, and assist in developing training materials for examiners and credit unions is simply not enough. That's a lot of work for just one person. We need to look at the future state and move strategically to that goal, not incrementally. Finally, we need to transparently allocate our resources by noting that the actual 2021 budget is marginally higher than the 2020 budget when you account for money carried over from the prior year's budget. And we need to shine a light on the agency's growing use of overhires as a way to keep the public counts of full-time employees relatively flat. Ultimately, we may also need to make other changes in the budget based on the input that we received today from today's witnesses and the comments that we received from them and others for the record. In considering this budget, I am committed to doing what is right for credit union members, the agency and its employees, the Share Insurance Fund, and the credit union system. I also know that if we take the time and work together, we can identify a mutually agreeable budget that addresses the concerns of everyone, including those aimed at advancing economic equality and justice. We must act to close the wealth gap, support minority depository institutions, and ensure compliance with fair lending laws so that people of all colors can buy a home, purchase a car, or finance college without being subject to discriminatory terms. In doing so, we will lift all boats and live up to the cooperative philosophy at the heart of the credit union movement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further comments at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. I will now ask Chief Financial Officer Eugene Shee to present the proposed budget. Good morning, Eugene, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Board Member, or Chairman Hood and Board Member Harper. My name is Eugene Shee, and I am the Chief Financial Officer of the National Credit Union Administration. I am here to present an overview of the staff draft NCOA 2021-2022 budget. I would like to thank stakeholders and members of the public for joining us this morning and showing their interest in the proposed budget. The staff draft budget was posted to our website on November 13th and also published in the Federal Register on November 19th. The public comment period is open until December 11th. This process is done to promote transparency and fiscal accountability regarding the NCOA's use of resources that are drawn from the credit union industry, and is in compliance with the NCOA's obligations under 12 U.S.C. Section 1789B. We continue to believe that the NCOA is unique among federal agencies for the accountability and transparency in our budget process. Slide 2. Slide 2 outlines the items I plan to cover in today's briefing. First, I will review the NCOA's strategic framework that is the foundation for the budget. Second, I will review some of the NCOA's key accomplishments over the past year. Third, I will discuss some of the key themes for the 2021-2022 budget and budget trends. Fourth, I'll present a summary of each of the 3 budgets that will be presented for approval at a future meeting of the board, which are the operating budget, the capital budget, and the Share Insurance Fund administrative budget. And finally, I'll review how the Ncua finances its budget. Slide 3. This slide shows the board-approved strategic plan goals and key linkages to the draft budget plan. The Ncoa's budget process starts with a review of the agency's goals and objectives set forth in its strategic plan. The strategic plan is a framework that sets the agency's direction and guides resource requests, ensuring the agency's resources and workforce are allocated and aligned to agency priority and initiatives. The Ncoa's budgets and the Ncoa's annual performance plans provide more detailed look into the specific plans and approaches that the Ncua will employ in furtherance of the strategic goals, and also includes how we plan to budget for our programs. The Ncua uses risk management on multiple levels to inform and guide the execution of its strategies. Components throughout the Ncua are responsible for identifying and addressing risk, some of which is evident in the proposed budget today. Within the Ncua, there are collaborative working relationships between line staff, first-level supervisors, managers, office directors, and the agency's executive leadership, including the board, so that when a risk is identified, it can be properly addressed. The next few slides will highlight some of the noteworthy results of the past year. Slide 4. When the budget for the current year was developed and approved by the board in December 2019, little did we know what awaited us in early 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impact began. 2020 became the year of responding to and dealing with the economic impact of the pandemic on Ncua operations and the credit union system. The Ncua, along with other federal financial services regulators, quickly pivoted to a mandatory off-site operating posture, including for examinations programs. The COVID-19 pandemic has meant a year of assessing and modifying existing regulations and guidance, and approaches to carrying out the Ncua mission to work with credit unions to protect the safety and soundness of the credit union system and the Share Insurance Fund. As I briefed the Ncua board at the July and November board meetings, the pandemic has meant changes to the 2020 budget and our plans for 2021. I will discuss this in greater detail as I work through this briefing. Finally, on this slide, it recaps a few of the highlights of actions the Ncua undertook in response to the pandemic, including guidance and letters to credit unions, modifying the examiner's guide, providing risk alerts. At the bottom of slide 4 is a link to where this guidance can be found on the Ncua's website. Slide 5. This slide highlights actions the Ncua has taken with respect to the regulatory framework, both in response to the pandemic and the strategic goal to promulgate efficient, targeted regulations to offer meaningful relief without undermining safety and soundness. As noted on this slide, that changes include pandemic-related relief for a streamlined process for prompt corrective actions, and the treatment of Paycheck Protection Program loans, as well as regulatory changes to enhance the central liquidity facility. Other regulatory changes in 2020 have included those that modify the agency's chartering and field of membership process and simplify several provisions of the corporate credit union regulation, as well as proposed rules on amendments to the agency's derivatives rule, the use of supervisory guidance, and the calculation of operating fees. Slide 6. Slide number 6 provides a consolidated view of the Ncua's draft budget proposals across the 3 individual budgets I am presenting today. In total, the budget for 2021 decreases by 1.4% as compared to 2020. The 2021 budget is impacted by the pandemic situation, and in particular by the reduced level of projected travel expenses both in 2020 and 2021. The draft operating budget decreases for 2021 by 0.1% as compared to the 2020 budget. The draft capital budget decreases for 2021 by 24.8% as compared to 2020, which is largely a function of the merit program moving into operations and maintenance phase as it is deployed, and thus funding begins to move into the operating budget. And finally, I'll discuss later in this presentation the planned changes to the Share Insurance Fund administrative budget, which reflects the cost of in-house stress testing validation tools. Slide 7. The overarching issue for 2021 will continue to be the economic impact of the pandemic on credit unions, their financial condition, and risk to the Share Insurance Fund and Ncua operations. In addition to the Ncua's response to the COVID-19 pandemic covered on the previous slides, actions Ncua is taking and will continue to take into 2021 include filling positions in the examinations workforce to be fully staffed as we enter 2021. The Ncua is working to fill agency vacancies and expects to close 2020 at the lowest vacancy rate in the past several years. We are preparing contingency contracts and plans for use by the Asset Management and Assistance Center to assist with liquidations and conservatorships that may arise. If used, these contracts will directly support the Ncua's efforts at resolving troubled credit unions, but will not be a direct charge to the budgets that are approved by the board that I am presenting today. We continue to use and adapt risk management tools and procedures to help analyze credit union financials to ensure that we are proactively working with credit unions, including direct outreach to certain institutions. And we continue to work closely with federal agencies and state supervisory authorities to ensure consistent guidance and to maintain open lines of communication. While the overall agency budget is declining modestly in 2021, our level of effort agency-wide is climbing, and we have mechanisms in place to deal with emerging risks and scenarios that may arise in response to an uncertain economic outlook. Many of these resources needed to deal with troubled or failed credit unions are funded through the asset management estates, and depending on the ultimate resolution of those particular situations, could be funded through charges to the Share Insurance Fund. This approach may be different from approaches where receivership or other resolution costs are shown on budget, such as with the FDIC. I point this out not to diminish the impact that this could have on the Ncua, but to note its relationship to the budgets that are being presented here today. While the Ncua does not budget for resolution, conservatorship, and liquidation costs through its annual budget process, I do present the key financial and performance statistics of the Share Insurance Fund each quarter at public meetings of the Ncua board. Finally, as I discussed in the July and November public meetings of the Ncua board, and will discuss in this presentation, the actual changes to the operating budget from 2020 to 2021 is impacted by the surplus in travel funding remaining from 2020 and in lower travel estimates for 2021. In the case of the staff draft budget for 2021, a reduced 2021 operating budget does not equate to a diminished agency capability for 2021. Slide 8. Beyond the pandemic response, the Ncua has a number of additional priorities addressed in this draft budget. This includes resources to support the development of the Access Initiative, advancing communities through credit, education, stability, and support. This initiative will refresh and modernize regulations, policies, and programs that all support greater financial inclusion within the agency and the credit union system, and will address the specific needs of diverse communities. In 2017, the board approved the Virtual Examinations Project, which provided funding to research methods to conduct off-site as many aspects of the examinations and supervision process as possible. At this past November board meeting, The board approved additional funding for this effort. The virtual examination project team is researching ways to harness new and emerging data, advancements in analytic techniques, innovative technology, and improvements in supervisory approaches. The draft budget also includes funding to complete the rollout of the first Examinations and Supervision Solution Project, MERIT, as well as to initiate the first project under the Data Collection and Sharing Solutions subprogram. The MERIT rollout was scheduled for 2020. However, the rollout was delayed because of the pandemic. Instead, the agency deployed a second release to current pilot users in July 2020 and began an extended pilot in September 2020 for additional users of the Ncua's 3 regional offices, the Wisconsin State Supervisory Authority, select corporate credit unions, and natural person credit unions of various asset sizes. The Ncua now plans to conduct training for its examiner workforce and other users in 2021, with deployment to all remaining system users in the third quarter of 2021. The next few slides present a summary-level view of the Ncua's budget trends, and staffing. Slide 9 shows the 2021 budget as compared with the Ncua's budget levels since 2010. The stacked bar chart shows the 3 board-approved budgets since 2010 and the proposal for 2021. The line graph running along the top of the chart shows the approved FTE staffing level since 2010, which has fluctuated within a fairly close margin and which increases slightly in the proposed budget. Slide 10. This slide compares the relative size of Ncua's budget to the federal banking regulators' budgets, expressed as a share of total system assets. The calculation divides the budget by millions of dollars by the prior year, credit union system, and banking system end-of-year assets, respectively. It is notable that the Ncua's budget, as a share of federally insured credit union assets, is continuing to decrease and remains below the equivalent rate for the federal banking system. These trends demonstrate the Ncua's continued operational efficiency compared both to the size of the credit union system and the operations of federal banking regulators and insurers. Slide 11. The Ncua's budget has historically been shown we've shown the size of the workforce in terms of full-time equivalents, or FTEs. FTE means the total number of hours worked, which do not include overtime or holiday hours worked by employees divided by the number of compensable hours applicable to each fiscal year. The measure of FTE is important because it directly relates to budget estimates for compensation costs. For 2021, the draft budget includes an increase of 5 FTE for the following: 1 consumer compliance officer and 1 new financial literacy specialist within the Office of Consumer and Financial Protection, 1 new senior credit specialist within the Office of Examination and Insurance, and 2 new executive positions to support emerging priorities. Federal agencies also manage staffing and hiring plans based on the authorized number of staff positions, which is also known in some cases as billets. The difference between FTE and authorized staffing levels acknowledges that all authorized positions are not filled at any given time due to staff turnover and because the hiring process takes some time. At the Ncua, this difference is often referred to as overhires, meaning the difference between the FTE expressed in the budget and the level of staffing that can be supported with that budget. In reviewing the FTE and staffing requests for 2021, the staff draft budget provides an additional 8 overhires that can be accommodated by our salary forecast for FTEs in 2021. These additional overhires are proposed to be allocated as follows: 5 new positions within the Office of National Examinations and Supervision to support the additional large credit unions that will come under one's supervision, 2 new positions for the Office of the Chief Information Officer to support the increasing complexity of the agency's IT systems, networks, and applications, and 1 new position within E&I to support additional risk management actions. The presentation will now shift to an overview of the operating budget proposal for 2021. Slide 12 displays the total operating budget of $315.6 million in a pie chart and our standard budget categories to highlight how the resources are allocated. Personnel salary and benefits costs remain the largest spending component, comprising over 76% of the agency budget. The other budget categories include contracted services, which makes up 15.1% of the budget, travel, which is reduced to 4.3% of the budget, rent, communications, and utilities, which makes up 2.3% of the budget, and administrative expenses, which is 2% of the budget. Slide 13. This slide shows the proposed budget for personnel costs, which is $240.9 million. This amount includes Ncua employees' salary and associated benefits, such as health insurance and retirement costs. Annually, my staff reestimates the Ncoa's compensation costs based on actual year-to-date spending and adjusting for workload hour utilizations and projected hiring. The collective bargaining agreement sets the parameters for pay adjustment to comply with the Federal Credit Union Act. This stipulates that Ncoa's compensation should maintain comparability with other federal bank regulatory agencies. Overall, the budget for employee salaries increases by approximately 3.4% in the draft budget proposal. The largest percentage growth in the pay and benefits category comes from the revised assumptions by the United States Office of Personnel Management for the actuarial valuation of the Federal Employee Retirement System, or FERS. The Ncua, like other federal agencies, has seen an increase in recent years. Charges for employees' FERS participation have increased significantly again for 2021. Federal agencies are required to contribute to the Federal Employees Retirement System run by the Office of Personnel Management. Federal agencies are expected to contribute 17.3% of FERS employees' salaries to the OPM retirement system, an increase of 130 basis points, or 8.1% growth as compared to the 2020 level. Slide 14. As I presented at the public budget meetings of the Ncua board during 2020, agency travel expenses have been sharply curtailed due to pandemic-related travel restrictions. While Ncua employees are still in a mandatory off-site posture, a very small level of travel still occurs periodically as urgent circumstances may warrant, consistent with our mission needs. The proposed new travel funding for 2021 is shown here as $13.5 million and will also include the use of $5.8 million from unspent 2020 travel budgets. Combined, travel would be funded in 2021 at roughly 70% of the 2020 budgeted level, anticipating that operational travel will only gradually return during the upcoming year. Slide 15. This slide shows the proposed budget for rent, communications, and utilities in the amount of $7.2 million, which is 12.6% below the 2020 level. Rent, communications, and utilities makes up only 2.3% of the total Ncua budget. This budget category includes costs for telephones and other telecommunication systems, building utilities, and regional office lease costs and meeting rental expenses. While some of these particular expenses have increased during the pandemic as the Ncua requires increased bandwidth and telecommunications, such increases are offset by a reduction in annual facilities-related expenses. The draft budget proposes to use approximately $3.7 million of unspent 2020 travel funds to pay off the remaining balance of the loan taken from the Share Insurance Fund for construction of the Ncua's central office building. This reduces rent, communications, and utilities budget by approximately $1.3 million per year for fiscal years 2021 through 2023. Slide 16. Slide 16 presents the summary of the Administrative Services budget category, which at 2% is the smallest share of the operating budget. This category supports a variety of administrative expenses, such as supplies, printing, shipping, and fees paid to support the Federal Financial Institutions Examinations Council. This category also includes costs associated with relocating staff to new duty stations. In 2020, the relocation expenses were funded by unspent agency resources from 2019, as approved by the Ncua board as a part of the 2020 budget plan. Slide 17 provides an overview of the draft budget for contracted services, which totals $47.8 million. This is an increase of $4.5 million, or just over 10%, as compared to 2020. Contracted services compose approximately 15.1% of the 2021 draft operating budget and consists of a variety of recurring activities and projects acquired to support various Ncua programs and operations. Slide 18. This slide details the categories of contracted services in the various subcategories we use to track the contracted services budget to provide greater insight into the composition of this expense category. This slide shows the wide range of support that the Ncua purchases with funding in this category, everything from critical information technology support and security to accounting, procurement, payroll, and human resource systems support that is largely acquired through cross-servicing agreements with other federal agencies, to facilities, security, training, and audit services and support. Slide 19 provides a brief description of the categories that were shown in the pie graph on slide 18 that I just mentioned. Growth in the contracted services budget category for 2021 results mostly from the additional operations and maintenance costs associated with capital investments, such as the Examinations and Supervision Solution, or MERIT system. Within the budget of the Office of the Chief Information Officer, the additional $3.8 million is required primarily for operations and maintenance costs of capital projects, including the MERIT system. As you will see later in this presentation, the budget for capital projects decreases, in part due to the planned completion of MERIT development. As requested in prior public comments, more detailed information about the Ncua's contracted services budget is found on pages 45 through 48 of the draft Budget Justification Document posted online. Slide 20. Slide 20 shows how the Ncua is proposing to reallocate some of the budgetary surplus, largely from other travel categories in the 2020 budget, to fund other items. I discussed some of these actions at the November public board meeting, at which time the board proposed several of the reallocations. As I noted in my presentation last month, there still remains a projected $10.4 million from the 2020 budget that will not be needed for Ncua operations this year, 2020. As shown in slide 20, the staff draft budget proposes to use the surplus of 2020 funds in the following way to support the Ncua, which reduces the need for new budgetary authority in 2021. The proposed use of carryover funds includes offsetting the projected 2021 budget needs for staff travel by $5.8 million, retiring the note due to the Share Insurance Fund for cost of the central office building, basically the mortgage for the central office that was funded by the SIF in the early 1990s. This retires the note 3 years early and lowers the operating budget from 2021 through 2023 and saves an estimated $85,000 in interest payments from the operating budget. And finally, $900,000 would be allocated to costs increases associated with ongoing pandemic in 2021, such as enhanced facility cleaning and related supplies. We believe this is a prudent use of unspent balances because it lowers the need for new resources in 2021, and the items funded with this estimated surplus will not create an additional budgetary requirement in future years. Slide 21. On slide 21, we turn to the NCOA's capital budget. The NCOA uses a rigorous process to identify investment needs for information technology, facility improvements and repair, and other multi-year capital investments. The capital budget includes funds for software development projects, hardware replacement and upgrades, and other information technology system costs, such as security upgrades to defend against cyber threats. The agency uses an Information Technology Prioritization Council to review and make recommendations on IT development projects. Overall, the capital budget decreases by $6.3 million as compared to 2020, or by nearly 25%. Slide 22. This slide is a summary of the 12 discrete major line item projects that would receive funding from the 2021 capital budget. The largest line item project continues to be the development of the ESS Merit Project, although the funding request for 2021 is about 1/2 of the amount funded in 2020. The majority of the rollout of the Merit system was delayed from 2020 to 2021 due to the pandemic. The next largest line item project is the IT Infrastructure Platform Security Refresh Project at almost $3.9 million. This project helps ensure that data is secure and the operations platform is stable and reliable to support the NCOA's workforce and our mission. The project includes a refresh and/or replacement of routers, switches, virtual servers, wireless infrastructure, the virtual private network, and infrastructure applications that are at the end of their service lives. As discussed in the November NCOA Board public meeting, the Board funded facilities-related upgrades at the central office with surplus 2020 funds, which removed $3 million from the planned capital budget for 2021. The staff draft budget provides detailed descriptions for each of the planned capital projects and can be found in Appendix B of the draft budget document on the NCOA website. Slide 23. This slide begins the overview of the Share Insurance Fund administrative budget. This budget pays for all direct costs of the Share Insurance Fund administration and management, including support for the NCOA's Guaranteed Notes program. For 2021, this budget increases by $1.6 million. Slide 24. This slide shows the category level detail of the SIF administrative budget. The largest SIF administrative budget category, and the one that represents nearly all of the increase over the 2020 budget, is the SIF direct expense category. Over a multi-year endeavor, the NCOA has developed and implemented its assets and liabilities management system, which in part allows the NCOA to build internal analytic capabilities and run supervisory stress testing analysis. The development of the ALM system was funded from the NCOA's capital budget in 2021 and prior years, but now that the system is in use, $1.4 million for operational and maintenance costs will be funded from the SIF budget in 2021 and future years. Slide 25. This slide begins the discussion on the operating fees and the financing of the NCOA budget. At the July board meeting, the NCOA board voted to publish proposed changes to the operating fee regulation and also to the operating fee methodology used to calculate the operating fee charged to federal credit unions. Slide 25 provides a brief recap of the key proposed changes. The board received 8 comments in response to the July 2020 notice published in the Federal Register, 3 from credit union trade associations, 4 from credit union leagues, and 1 from a credit union service organization. These comments are currently under review by staff. The 2021 operating fee will be based on the board's final decision about the proposed changes after considering the public comments. Slide 26. Slide 26 summarizes the financing sources for the NCOA's budget. Pages 57 to 65 of the published draft budget provide a detailed overview of the two major financing sources of the Ncua budget: the operating fee paid by federal credit unions and the overhead transfer rate drawn from the Share Insurance Fund. The table and pie chart on this slide illustrate the proportions of the Ncua budget paid by federal credit unions and federally insured state credit unions. In percentage terms, we estimate that the federal credit unions will cover 69% of the 2021 budget, while the FISCUs would pay for 31%. As compared to the number of institutions and system assets, federal credit unions comprise 63% of federally insured credit unions and have 51% of systems assets, while FISCUs have 37% of the credit unions and 49% of the assets. The aforementioned proposal to alter the operating fee methodology does not materially impact the distributions shown on slide 26, because these proposed changes primarily modify how the operating fee would be assessed amongst the federal credit unions. Slide 27. All of the draft 2021 budget information is posted on the NCOA's website at the link shown on this slide, which adds to the extensive documentation available to the public that explains how the Ncua spends its resources to ensure credit union system safety and soundness. Slide 28. I'll conclude my presentation by reiterating a few key points. The three draft budgets for 2021 include the operating budget of $315.6 million and 1,186 FTE, the capital budget of $18.8 million, and the Share Insurance Fund administrative budget of $8.1 million and 5 FTE. Combined, the proposed new budget authority for 2021 would decline by 4.1%, although it would be supported by the use of surplus 2020 budget amounts, as I have outlined in this presentation. The extent to which the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will affect credit unions and their members, the Share Insurance Fund, and Ncua operations remains to be seen. Much planning and analysis will continue as the situation unfolds. I have outlined in my presentation some of the changes the agency has made with respect to regulations, guidance, and procedures to deal with COVID-19 pandemic and its economic impact, and we have actively been filling vacant staff positions and planning for contingencies to deal with a wide range of possible scenarios for 2021. The staff draft budget reflects our commitment to efficiency while ensuring that we have the resources necessary to accomplish our mission to provide for a safe and sound credit union system. Finally, as noted on this slide, the due date for public comments to submit written comments on the draft budget is Friday, December 11th, 2020. On slide 29, I have included my contact information for any members of the public who have questions or want to contact my office about the materials that I have presented today. The presentation also includes a short appendix of materials that I don't plan to review in this briefing. The appendix has more detailed information about the Ncua's funds and where to find the Ncua's section of the President's annual budget to Congress. Thank you for your time today. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks on the proposed staff draft budget. Thank you. And at this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions you or Board Member Harper have.
Well, Gene, thank you for your very informative and in-depth presentation on the budget proposal. I especially want to thank all of our Ncua staff who played a role in drafting this budget proposal today. The Ncua Board and the Ncua staff are responsible for overseeing the safety and soundness of the country's credit union system and protecting the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. Our actions impact over 5,000 credit unions that serve over 122 million member owners. I know that the budget for 2021-2022 was a challenging one for the staff to pull together. in light of the impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on credit unions and Ncua operations, and in anticipating and planning for what might transpire in 2021. This presents many uncertainties in which staff all conducted their budget planning processes. In developing a draft budget, staff has weighed and balanced the need to execute the Ncua mission and the increased workload the agency may see in 2021 against the need to be fiscally responsible and prudent in light of the economic stress on the credit union system. Eugene, I do now have a few questions for you, sir. First, could you please clarify the number of staff the agency would plan to add to its workforce under this proposal? It seems like maybe there's more than one way that this is described in the budget briefing you've just given us.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question so that I can help clarify the planned changes to the staffing levels. So as I mentioned, there's a few different statistics that federal agencies often use to report the size of their workforce. Our budget documents have consistently used FTE, or full-time equivalents, because it measures the number of hours worked and for which employees will be compensated, and that translates directly into our pay and benefits calculations. But as I was mentioning in my remarks, there's another way to look at it, another statistic, which is the number of positions or billets that an agency may have as a part of its table of organization, which is how many positions it is seeking to fill in total, although most agencies never get there because, as I mentioned, there's staff turnover and the time that it takes to hire new positions. Our staff draft budget contains more detail on pages 39 and 40. And to your question, we're adding 5 FTE to the budget, but in addition to that, adding 8 additional positions that we think we can fit within our management of the overall salaries and benefits level. So combined together, that would be an increase of 13 additions to the Ncua workforce if all those positions were filled. That concludes my response, Chairman.
Thank you. I also noticed that the budget decreases at a time when the workload on Ncua increases. Are other federal financial regulators considering budgetary increases that you are aware of? And why do you think it makes sense for the budget? And it's a two-parter, Eugene, just for timing there. And then why do you think it makes sense for the budget to go down when workload may be going up? So I'll let you take both of those, please.
Okay, sure. So I haven't seen any specific documents yet from the other federal financial regulators, so I really couldn't say with certain authority as to what their upcoming budgets might look like. Informally, I think that they're probably going up, but again, I haven't seen any published proposals that I've been able to analyze for comparability to the Ncua budget, because as I mentioned, some of the just looking at the face of the budget proposals doesn't necessarily indicate sort of the level of comparability given how we may differently fund our operations. I would say in response to the second part of that question about why this makes sense to see a slight decrease when workload may be going up, I think you have to really take a look at the total resources that will be available to the organization. So as I mentioned, there will be some there'll be some carryover resources that we'll have from 2020 into 21 that'll help bolster and support Ncua operations. And as again, also as I mentioned, just the fact that there's projected to be less travel next year as we continue to unwind the pandemic situation. I think that lowers sort of artificially what the travel costs will be next year as compared to quote unquote a normal year. And I think we've demonstrated that we can perform well in a remote posture. And so that sort of makes the budget look lower than it otherwise would. So I think, based on that, I think we're, even though the budget looks like it's going down, another way to look at it is it's going up. But I think in any case, it positions us well to deal with 2021. Back to you, sir.
Great, thank you. And again, I'd just like to reiterate, this year's budget decrease the agency sees today is largely because of travel savings as we all operate in a remote work posture. And while this is a good start, I think we can always do more as stewards of the credit union system's money. Eugene, when was the last time the Ncua saw a budget decrease year over year?
The last one I'm aware of, looking back at our historical budget records, would be 2005, I think, was the last year that we actually saw a situation similar to this with a year-over-year decrease. Back to you.
Thank you. And do you think the agency is prepared for any fallout from COVID-19 with the budget you just presented, even with the modest decreases that we've been able to recognize through travel reduction?
So yes, I mean, to reiterate a few of the points I think that we try to make in the budget and the presentation, I think we, through our continuous monitoring of the pandemic's impact on credit unions and Ncua operations, I think we're prepared. I'd also point to several things. We don't include, there's no reduction in the 2021 budget for any field staff. Relative to the consolidation or merger trends and the one-time merit training that'll use up examiner hours in 2021, this incorporates some additional exams capacity for 2021 and really even more for 2022 as we look, sort of to the multi-year impact of what the economic situation may look like. As I mentioned, we're doing all our efforts to be well-staffed for 2021, particularly making sure that we're well-staffed in the field, which has not historically been the case. I'm anticipating that we'll be at a rather historic low compared to recent years in terms of vacancies at the end of the year based on the hiring plans that we have. We're setting up contingency contracts, as I mentioned, so my office is working closely with AMAC to make sure that we've got the external support for liquidation activity, which again is going to be funded mostly by the estates and indirectly by the SIF versus the operating budget. And with those contingency contracts that we're setting up, we're also putting in options so that if needed, we could use the budgets that we're talking about here today, such as the operating budget, to tap into some of those resources if we've got the funds available. And I'd mentioned that the normal budgetary process, we include a reassessment during the year of our funding and workload needs. And so we would re-examine cost trends for activities such as travel, which could be reprogrammed to address contingency resources as needed. So I think with all that, I think there's a variety of options that we would have that we could go to if certain workload activities shifted differently than what we're anticipating. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Eugene. Regarding staffing, did any of the regions ask for additional staff for supervisory work?
No. I reviewed so each of the offices sends in budget memos to me, and in reviewing those formal requests made from the regions, none of the 3 geographic regions requested additional staff. Sometimes we lump in ones into that category, and we've recommended some additional positions for the ones office, as I mentioned. Back to you.
Very well. Well, then how many examiner openings do we currently have at the agency?
So based on the head count that I got, which was just before Thanksgiving, there were 49 examiner and specialist positions currently vacant within Ncua, with plans to onboard 45 new examiners, so most of that contingent in the December and January timeframe.
Very well, thank you. Can you please explain how the agency adjusted its capital expenditures this year relative to last year?
Okay. So I guess I'd point to 2 different changes in sort of capital expenditure, depending on kind of how you're looking at it. First, the proposed capital budget decreases, and that's based on how we assess the need for continuing and or capital projects each year. So some projects wind down or come to completion and roll out of the capital budget, such as merit or the ALM program that I had mentioned. And at the same time, there's new projects such as the upgrade to technology infrastructure, platform, and security in the phone system that increase. And we take those, kind of each on a project-by-project, year-by-year basis. with the net change being a 25% decrease for 2021. The second way you can sort of address the question, sir, is that our budget reflects the proposal to change the way that we treat the timing of capital expenditures. And this is part of the proposal to adjust the operating fee methodology, which I briefed in July, and which we've recently received industry comments. So with respect to the capital expenditures in that consideration, we've proposed a consistency in the timing of contributions towards expenditures for capital projects between what's funded by the operating fee and contributions from the Share Insurance Fund. Back to you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Eugene. And I do have one final question for you, sir. Earlier this year, the agency senior level executives had a 2-day strategic planning session. Isn't it true that the new Access Financial Inclusion Initiative was driven out of that particular planning session? And was the consensus the recommendation by senior level career executives at the agency for us to launch the Access piece?
So yes, senior leadership, and including myself, did engage in the strategic planning session this year that you mentioned. And I would say collectively we identified during those sessions a need to make financial inclusion one of the agency's top priorities and to organize and resource ourselves around this effort. So yes, sir, I would agree with that. Back to you.
Great, thank you. As I often say, financial inclusion is indeed the civil rights issue of our generation, and given a lot of the economic disparities that we're seeing, I'm delighted to know that our agency senior leaders recognize the role that Ncua and credit unions can play in addressing some of those disparities that exist. I want to applaud you all for coming up with this idea and for really providing the flexibility to launch Access. I do think that as we advance communities through credit, education, stability, and support, it will leave an indelible mark in the lives of many of our marginalized communities. So, Eugene, thank you. I have no further questions. I now would like to turn the floor over to Board Member Harper for questions. Mr. Harper, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And Eugene, thank you again for your detailed presentation, as well as the hard work of you and your staff in putting together this draft budget. I have 2 lines of question for you, and both of these have to do with transparency. My first questions are about the size of the actual 2021 proposed budget. If we could turn to slide 6. As I understand it, Eugene, there are 3 ways 2020 surplus funds are being used to reduce the 2021 operating budget. First, by reducing the travel budget by $6 million. Second, by paying for what is expected to be one-time COVID-related costs like enhanced cleaning services by approximately $856,000. And third, by paying for the cost of the central office note by approximately $1.3 million. With that in mind, what is the actual 2021 budget increase before the reductions created by the remaining 2020 budget surplus? Instead of dropping by 0.1%, aren't we really increasing agency spending in the operating budget by 2.5% under this proposal?
So I think as you've noted in the question, the intro to that, yes, there are, as you mentioned, several ways in which we're pulling forward from 2020 into 2021. This proposal suggests using sort of surplus resources, which lowers the new budget authority that we'd be looking to finance through the operating fee and the OTR for 2021. And generally, I'd agree that what you've outlined is another way to take a look at that budget. We're talking about what the budget might have looked like had we not had the travel surplus, or if we would have applied it differently. And I think that's I could certainly see that as a way to characterize the 2021 budget. Yes, sir. Back to you.
Thank you, Eugene. My second line of questions is about transparency in the staffing number as found on slide 11. As we head into next year, the Ncua needs to be adequately funded and fully staffed. In my view, we should be transparent about how many people are on the payroll when we are fully staffed. Yet, as you noted, the agency uses overhires or billets, a less than transparent tool to manage its total staffing needs. In 2020, the Ncua, as I understand, had 24 overhires. That number jumps by 8 to 10 overhires in the proposed 2021 budget, depending on whether you count a couple of detailees versus the 8 additional people you list here under the internal allocations being moved around. So when you add authorized FTEs and overhires together, the agency's 2021 staffing actually comes to about 1,225 employees, not the 1,191 FTEs called for in the budget. Eugene, is there a more transparent staffing practice that the agency could be using to clarify for stakeholders our actual staffing needs? Why couldn't the Ncua use a more clearer and more transparent staffing policy?
Okay. So we've historically used the FTE and been pretty consistent with that as a description or a measure of the workforce for purposes of the budget, again, because it really tracks to compensation levels. I see the draft budget document as a step in the direction I think that you're describing, because it includes a description of other staffing adjustment, i.e. the overhires, which we haven't typically talked about. But those additional positions are important for the Ncua's 2021 plan to meet its mission objectives. So we've given this increased view to the stakeholders about how we intend to execute in 2021 to meet changes in workload and requirements among offices. And I think we can continue to look at ways to build on that and sort of continue to assess what provides the most useful and relevant information for stakeholders in understanding how the Ncua plans to conduct its business in an upcoming year and how it's using industry resources. Back to you.
Thank you, Eugene. And I also think it's important that the agency work internally to develop clearer policies on what is an overhire, when it is used, and what are the procedures on it. I know that there is some differences in how we apply that to different offices and different positions, and then sometimes it goes with a specific position, and other times it's just generally allocated against an office's budget. I think that we, for clarity, for consistency, and for making sure that nobody feels like they aren't a fully participating member of our workforce, that they understand that. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks. I have nothing further to add at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Now, everyone, I'd like to turn the agenda over to our stakeholders for their presentations. Mr. Shink, Mr. Long, and Ms. Ito, good morning to all of you and welcome. I'd like to thank you all for providing your comments to the Ncua in this public forum. As a reminder, you will each have up to 15 minutes to present, and all comments and questions will be held until the end. We will begin with Mr. Shink, followed by Mr. Long, who will then be followed by Ms. Ito. Mr. Shink, good morning, and you may begin.
Good morning. I'm Mike Schenk, Chief Economist at the Credit Union National Association. I appreciate the opportunity to share CUNA's observations and general commentary on the Ncua budget process, the budget itself, and on the agency's strategic direction, which of course is the foundation for this budget proposal. As you know, CUNA is the largest trade association serving America's credit unions. In fact, just yesterday I learned that CUNA membership stands at its highest level in over a decade, with nearly 90% of the nation's federal and state credit unions affiliated. On behalf of these credit unions and their 120 million members, I would like to thank you for opening the Ncua budget process to credit unions and to credit union stakeholders. As in the past, I'll share some of our general thoughts and conclusions in these brief remarks, and of course, we'll provide you with a substantially more detailed written document following this briefing. First and foremost, I want to be very clear that we recognize that the Ncua is the only FREA agency that publishes a detailed draft budget that rationalizes agency expenditures in the context of a well-communicated strategic plan, soliciting public comment on that draft in a meeting like this with the board and a number of key agency senior staff present. CUNA and our members really appreciate this distinction. We applaud the agency for its leadership and transparency. Please keep doing this. This process is incredibly important. As advocates, seeing these details and connections help us all better articulate to our member credit unions exactly what the agency is doing and why you're doing it. Given their unique ownership structure, credit unions deserve to know how and where their members' money is being spent. They deserve to see the link between those expenditures and their mission of improving financial well-being for all. And they definitely deserve to weigh in, directly or indirectly, when they perceive a significant disconnect in your spending plans when compared to their core mission. In any case, we once again find that Ncua's Budget Justification Document is clear, comprehensive, and well-developed. The proposed activities and expenditures described generally align with strategic initiatives like the Virtual Examination Project and Enterprise Solution Modernization that you've previously announced and that we, CUNA, have discussed, analyzed, and broadly support. It also, we believe, appropriately responds to changing supervisory priorities, especially in light of the COVID-19 crisis. The NCUA's proposed 2021 budget reflects a 1.4% decrease in expenditures overall. The operating budget, which accounts for 92% of total agency expenditures, reflects a modest 0.1% decline. This all seems reasonable against the backdrop of inflation, which is running at about 1.2% annually these days, and when compared to credit union operating expenses, the point of reference for most credit union CEOs, which are up about 4% on an annualized basis this year. However, as outlined in the Budget Justification Document, a big part of the apparent fiscal restraint, and this was of course mentioned by Board Member Harper, a good part of that fiscal restraint is reflected in the numbers related to the decline in travel expenses in 2020 and the expectation that travel will continue to be restricted in the new year. As Eugene described, within the 2021 operating budget, pay and benefits represent roughly 76% of total operating expenditures, and the $241 million proposed total is up 4.1%. This mostly covers adjustments required by the agency's collective bargaining agreement. Furthermore, about 25% of the increase can be traced to the combination of mandatory employer contributions for retirement and health benefits and the addition of 5 new employees. The justification document is a fairly high-level summary that, perhaps by design, omits some of the detail necessary to adequately assess the need and rationalization for some of these expenditures. So, for example, the proposed expenditures for each of the individual 5 new positions proposed. We know the duties to be performed, that's explained in the document, but we know really little about the need for those duties to be performed. In a similar way, we know about plans for office renovations, but we know little about how the agency might have contemplated a new normal operating environment that might involve more remote and less in-person work and the potential effects that that might have on the need for renovations. So I just want to emphasize that in general, CUNA believes that the efficiency of NCUA's operations is by definition essential to responsibly using credit unions' members' resources as NCUA seeks to become a world-class regulator. We've said it in the past, we believe there's an immense capacity for NCUA to reduce its footprint, right-size the organization, and come out of the resulting transition as a nimble, stronger, and more efficient, more effective regulator. Furthermore, we have real concerns about any obvious expansion in consumer protection examination activity. Our members believe altering the agency's risk-focused examination process and substantially increasing consumer examination-related expenditures is simply not warranted. The agency provides no supplementary evidence to suggest credit unions consumer compliance management has become a risk area warranting an increase in expenditures or additional agency resources. As its mission statement makes clear, the Ncua exists to ensure the safety and soundness of the credit union system overall, and its examination program should remain focused on that objective. In addition, the agency already has the tools in place to further evaluate an individual credit union's consumer compliance program when that need is identified through the risk-focused examination process. Regrettably, the COVID-19 crisis has paused some of the anticipated progress on realizing efficiencies. But at the same time, it also seems to have better positioned the agency for the possibility of a more seamless rollout of important programs in 2021. For example, while the crisis has interrupted in-person merit system training, it's also clearly demonstrated the agency's resiliency and its ability to adapt quickly, with pandemic-necessitated switch to off-site examinations, providing key learnings that we think are likely to improve and maybe even accelerate some of the progress towards goals in the future, especially within the virtual exam project. COVID-19 pandemic and the uncertain economic environment has stressed credit unions, and as outlined in the Budget Justification Document, it might continue to do so, perhaps in more obvious ways. The Ncua has been responsive to a variety of CUNA requests throughout the COVID-19 crisis and has worked diligently to help reduce friction and to streamline credit union operations and service provision. The agency has consistently listened to ideas and has actively looked for constructive solutions to complex challenges. Your helpful responses have ranged from pursuing increased access to the central liquidity facility, postponing implementation dates of various regulations, as well as embracing initiatives like easing troubled debt restructuring provisions and proposing the capitalization of interest. These activities and initiatives have helped thousands of credit unions throughout the country ease the burden on millions of consumers. For their part, credit unions continue to behave like credit unions always have in crisis. The nation's cooperative financial institutions with depositor ownership and democratic control view capital as a war chest to be built up during good times and used during tough times, get their members through crisis with as little disruption as possible. This was obvious during the Great Recession and its aftermath, and it was reflected in a 13% increase in credit union loan portfolios between 2007 and 2012, while in the banking industry, loans declined by 3% over that time. Credit union performance during the current COVID-19 crisis also stands out. A CUNA survey conducted soon after the crisis unfolded concluded that 95% of credit unions offered loan modifications to their members. 90% waived fees. 86% created new loan products to meet members' pressing needs. In addition, the nation's credit unions collectively originated nearly 200,000 Small Business Administration Paycheck Protection Program loans totaling $10 billion. The typical credit union PPP lender reported a loan size of $49,000, less than half the size reported by banks, and a clear indication that credit unions were firmly focused on small, independent, mom-and-pop businesses, not national chain restaurants, not professional sports teams, and the like. Credit union supervisory authorities, including the Ncua and state-level prudential regulators, must continue to cultivate and encourage these natural pro-social behaviors. The transformative power of cooperative finance cannot be fully realized by treating not-for-profit financial institutions as though they are for-profit. Our members believe strongly that credit union regulators must resist any temptation to view the institutions they supervise through the same lens used by regulators in the banking arena. And they must constantly look for ways to increase consumer access to support improved financial well-being for all. In that regard, CUNA members urge the agency to view capital as they do, resisting the temptation to pursue legislation that transforms the Share Insurance Fund into a bank-like entity, and to commit to reducing the normal operating level to a level closer to its 1.3% historical norm. While the FDIC has operated in the red twice over the past 30 years, the Ncua has never finished a year below 1.2% over that period of time. Collecting premium assessments has never been an issue historically, even in the toughest of times. The need to recall and recast the nature of the Ncua, transforming it into a bank-like fund, is simply unwarranted and should be strongly resisted. In a similar vein, we hope the Ncua will use the COVID-19 crisis as a reference point for additional, meaningful field of membership reform. This issue isn't fully explored in the budget document, but it's clear the COVID-19 crisis has exposed fundamental field of membership challenges and deficiencies and has produced a heightened awareness of safety and soundness concerns around the concentrated risk in specific industries. Of course, industries that require employees to interact face-to-face with customers have been especially hard hit in the COVID-19 crisis. For example, the leisure and hospitality industry, including restaurants, hotels, theme parks, and the like, saw a near immediate decline in employment with 8.3 million jobs lost in the 2 months ending April 2020. As local economies opened, the employment situation in this industry improved, but overall, employment remains over 20% lower than February's pre-pandemic level. Some credit unions, though certainly not all, with narrow fields of membership serving these hard-hit sectors are highly vulnerable. Of course, the concept of field of membership was conceived roughly a century ago as a way to minimize the negative effects of asymmetric information in the credit process before the existence of widespread credit reporting. But times have changed. The concept of field of membership is not essential to what a credit union is. And in practice, it's not only hindering the ability to improve financial well-being for all, but it can expose the insurance fund to unnecessary risk. We appreciate Ncua's efforts to work within the law to explore ways to bring credit union service to a wider diversity of average Americans. Field of membership changes you've implemented have been impactful and beneficial, but we believe more can and should be done. On behalf of CUNA, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm happy at this point to address any questions that you might.
Thank you, Mr. Schenk. And actually, we will be saving all questions and comments until all of you have presented, but thank you for your remarks. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Long. Good morning, Mr. Long, and welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Hood and Board Member Harper. My name is Kurt Long. I'm the Chief Economist and Vice President of Research at the National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions, or NAFCU. I want to thank the Ncua Board for its leadership and ongoing commitment to ensuring a safe and sound credit union system and improving the lives of over 122 million credit union members across the country. A strong, independent Ncua is always one of NAFCU's key priorities, and NAFCU supports the Ncua Board's transparency surrounding the budget. NAFCU applauds the Ncua for being a leader among financial services regulators in publishing a detailed draft budget, hosting an open budget hearing, and providing an opportunity for feedback from the industry to improve the efficient use of credit union dollars. Nonetheless, the agency should continue to find ways of adapting to the changing environment and transitioning to new supervision and examination methods that do not result in significant year-over-year budget increases. NAFCU encourages the Ncua to continue an ongoing agency-wide commitment to managing its funds in a prudent and transparent way that uses cost savings as a learning opportunity and not a rationale for future budget increases. Today, NAFCU outlines several recommendations to improve the efficiency of its budget, including 1, preserving the strength of the SIF and avoiding unnecessary assessments on credit unions, 2, continuing to pursue exam modernization efforts and identify cost-saving opportunities in the transition to primarily virtual exams, 3, achieving a reasonable and tailored budget for cybersecurity expenses, and 4, supporting financial inclusion through the Ncua's New Access initiative with a focus on enhancing field of membership and other growth opportunities. NAFCU commends the agency on realizing savings in its day-to-day operations in 2020 and encourages the Ncua to utilize lessons learned from the pandemic and forced virtual exam posture to achieve long-term budget reductions. However, absent the reductions due to the COVID pandemic, NCUA's budget continues to increase year over year. The projected budget increases for 2022 signify that the agency is headed in the wrong direction with respect to operating an efficient budget. The 2021 proposed operating fund budget represents a decrease of 0.1% compared to the 2020 board-approved budget. However, this reduction is due to COVID-related travel savings. Moreover, the 2022 proposed budget represents an increase of 8.3% over 2021. It also represents a 44% increase in only a decade, while the credit union industry is on pace to consolidate by 31% over that same time frame. The 2022 budget increase is partly due to a rebound in travel costs, but non-travel costs have been increasing at a steadily accelerating pace, exceeding 5% annual growth in the proposed 2022 budget. The credit union industry remains focused on the efficient use of resources and encourages the NCUA to do so as well by achieving year-over-year budget reductions. With respect to staff levels, the operating budget for 2021 requests a net increase of 5 FTEs from the 2020 board-approved levels. Since 2018, the level of FTEs has been relatively flat. NAFCU applauds the NCUA for maintaining steady staff levels, but when combined with the consolidation in the number of credit unions, this should provide conditions suitable to keeping operating budget growth much lower than its current path. NAFCU once again implores the agency to conduct a cost-benefit analysis for each new FTE with the goal of achieving the types of budgetary efficiencies that will arrest the upward drift in expenditures. NAFCU and its member credit unions also remain concerned about growing expenses related to contracted services. This portion of the operating budget increases by 10.3% in 2021 and by 11.8% in 2022. Although NAFCU strongly supports the agency's efforts to modernize its exam and supervision solution by transitioning to merit, this exceeds the projections outlined in last year's budget. Incremental increases, although relatively minor on their own, compound an already growing annual budget. As NAFCU outlined last year, contracted services comprise a considerable portion of the NCUA's operating budget, and the agency should work to find cost-effective means of training existing staff to conduct certain activities to minimize reliance on contracted services and reduce the size of this budget. Although the agency continues to point to a decline in the relative size of the NCUA budget compared to the balance sheets at federally insured credit unions, industry asset growth alone does not mean the budget is more efficient. Considering the NCUA examines and supervises credit unions, not assets, NAFCU encourages a commitment to evaluating opportunities for cost savings and budget reductions year over year. To clearly demonstrate this commitment to the prudent management of credit union dollars, the NCUA should always engage in cost-benefit analysis as it looks to existing and future programs. Most importantly, this year NAFCU recommends the agency focus on implementing lessons learned from the pandemic and holistically improving key supervisory elements to find economies of scale and other efficiencies in the 2021 and 22 proposed budgets. Turning to the Share Insurance Fund, NAFCU applauds the NCUA's steps to sell the taxi medallion loans under management by AMAC in a single transaction early in 2020, as it has proven to bolster the fund. As NAFCU's SIF committee pointed out prior to the sale, the unusually large taxi medallion portfolio would strain agency resources and pose a risk to the credit union community, so long as it remained under management by AMAC. While NAFCU did not anticipate a global pandemic at the time we offered this advice, we believe that retaining the portfolio in the hopes of extracting a higher sales price presented unnecessary risks, and recommended that the agency divest the portfolio at the earliest opportunity so long as it received a fair price. Recent NCUA board meetings have featured discussions of expanding the agency's statutory authorities over the SIF, including the ability to charge premium assessments when the equity ratio exceeds 1.3%. NAFCU opposes such changes as the SIF's historical record shows that they are unnecessary. NAFCU supports a 1.3% equity ratio and opposes discretionary premiums should the equity ratio fall below 1.3%. If the Ncua is required to charge a premium should the equity ratio fall below 1.2% due to extraordinary share growth, then NAFCU urges the Ncua to implement a lengthy restoration plan. Moderate recessions have not precipitated large premium assessments in the past. If the Ncua insists that more authorities are needed to manage the fund to withstand the impact of a moderate recession, or if a moderate recession is no longer the proper standard, NAFCU would appreciate the opportunity for public comment or a hearing on this matter. Furthermore, NAFCU believes that the agency should clarify how discretionary premium assessments interact with credit union capital levels and other goals the agency has stressed, such as investments in cybersecurity and financial technology. In the near term, the Ncua should also evaluate its authority to provide credit unions with additional investment authorities to help manage the large share growth they have experienced this year. NAFCU appreciates the Ncua's prioritization of its exam modernization initiatives, including the virtual exam program to further standardize exams and relieve burdens. The Ncua should also use this opportunity to move toward lengthening the exam cycle for healthy, well-run credit unions. The COVID pandemic has required the agency to conduct virtual exams and begin gathering more information for the transition to primarily virtual exams within the next 5 to 10 years. Considering the cost savings from 2020 due to reduced travel expenses, the Ncua should quickly pivot to more virtual exams going forward and incorporate lessons learned to achieve reductions by cutting unnecessary travel and other expenses. The surplus 2020 travel funds provides an opportunity to determine how much travel is ideal for examiners and credit unions. Examiners and the agency overall have seen that much of the day-to-day work can be achieved remotely. Although NAFCU's members support continued in-person interaction with examiners during the exam process instead of a fully virtual exam posture, some efficiencies can be achieved with respect to the amount of travel required for examiners. NAFCU strongly supports the Ncua's commitment to modernizing its exam process and hopes to see the agency leverage advances in technology to reduce the length of exams, improve consistency, and reduce the overall burden on credit unions. Virtual exams have the potential to enhance consistency in the exam process by implementing standardized protocols for examiners and improving the overall quality of the exam process for all parties. Despite delays due to the COVID pandemic, NAFCU is also pleased to see advances in the implementation of the ESM program, which includes the replacement of ARIES with the new merit system. This new platform could ultimately provide cost savings for both credit unions and examiners, but its implementation does not come without substantial investment. NAFCU is pleased to learn that the bulk of examiner workforce training for the new merit system has already been funded in 2020, and new training requiring significant travel expenses will not be required in 2021. NAFCU looks forward to this new system providing substantial efficiencies and helping the agency to transition to primarily virtual exams. NAFCU appreciates the agency's attention to our calls for additional updates regarding the progress of its exam modernization initiatives. Formal updates at Ncua board meetings are extremely helpful for the credit union industry. In these updates, it is important that the Ncua delineate what success looks like for the agency so that credit unions understand potential expectations and responsibilities. NAFCU urges the agency to continue this trend throughout 2021 and beyond. NAFCU appreciates the recent interagency rule on supervisory guidance, which clarifies the role of supervisory guidance as distinct from formal rulemaking, as it does not create legally binding obligations on credit unions. This is a step in the right direction, but more remains to be done because credit unions continue to experience increases in exam burden. The agency should ensure that the spirit of the interagency rule is applied to its exams and that examiners are not substituting exam findings and changes in the exam process for public rulemaking under the Administrative Procedure Act. Unofficial policy guidance is not equivalent to a statute, regulation, order, or clearly unsafe or unsound practice, and credit unions should not receive findings or documents of resolution for violations of any supervisory guidance. NAFCU reiterates its call to improve accountability and reduce exam burden by adopting a formal feedback mechanism. The industry would greatly benefit from a feedback mechanism akin to the FDIC's post-exam survey. The NCOA should institute a similar survey, the results of which would be sent to the NCOA's ombudsman, to allow for candid feedback on issues like exam fairness, consistency, and overall burden. Such a survey could help to improve overall accountability and promote transparency within the agency's exam function. NAFCU understands the delicate balance between the agency's dual roles as a regulator, but is concerned that NCOA examiners will continue to take an overly risk-averse approach to exams. Given the economic downturn and continued uncertainty due to the pandemic, NAFCU urges the NCOA to prioritize flexibility and transparency in its exam process so that credit unions can safely emerge from this difficult time. A key element of this approach includes working to provide consistency and clarity in the exam processes and procedures, especially with respect to areas of heightened risk such as cybersecurity. NAFCU's member credit unions continue to identify cybersecurity as a top concern for their institution. According to the results of a recent NAFCU survey, on average, 7.2% of credit unions' current operating budget is devoted to cybersecurity, a 225% increase over 2015. Over the next 3 years, 94% of responding credit unions intend to further increase IT spending, and 66% expect to increase the number of FTEs devoted to IT compliance. The magnitude of credit union investments in cybersecurity demonstrates the industry's successful adaptation to the current threat landscape. But these investments, much like the NCOA's own, must take into consideration the marginal benefit of each additional dollar as security. Fortunately, the Ncua appears to recognize that cost-effective cybersecurity depends, to a certain extent, on harmonization of standards and leveraging already available resources. In 2020, the Ncua shifted its priority from administering ACET maturity assessments to evaluating critical security controls. NAFCU supports this change in focus. Now that the agency has a better understanding of the industry's cyber maturity across different asset tiers, the critical security controls should provide a familiar and more streamlined approach for assessing the industry's security posture and cyber hygiene. Likewise, the NTREC CU pilot offers a promising avenue to develop more consistent cybersecurity exams that builds upon the work done by other federal banking agencies. Although NAFCU expects the NCOA's cyber-related exam initiatives to have a positive effect on the industry, we ask that the agency provide a more descriptive accounting of how their benefits will be assessed in the long term. Likewise, additional analysis regarding certain cybersecurity-related investments described in the Budget Justification would give credit unions greater confidence that improvements to the agency's overall security posture are cost-effective. For example, the Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Project is described as improving the agency's overall situational awareness. However, there's little information provided to compare this improvement against the agency's existing capabilities. As we have noted in prior years, NAFCU is concerned that some of the agency's proposed investments in cybersecurity improvements, however well-intentioned, may be decoupled from results-based metrics and may continue to drive costs disproportionately, resulting in yearly budget increases. IT expenses encompass a significant share of the agency's growing budget for contracted services, and NAFCU asks that the agency provide additional detail regarding whether security-related expenses associated with merit, NTREC CU, and ongoing FSMA compliance are mainly one-time or ongoing costs. If they are ongoing, the Ncua should describe the metrics or processes it uses to determine whether IT or cyber-related costs are proportional to the agency's overall risk tolerances. Despite our budgetary concerns, NAFCU appreciates the agency's transparency in cybersecurity-related matters. The recent briefing delivered during the Ncua Board's October meeting, along with the promulgation of useful guidance responding to COVID-related cybersecurity threats, continues to help inform the industry of the agency's priorities and concerns. As an association, we have also found it easy to work with Ncua staff to better understand the agency's cybersecurity initiatives. And we thank Johnny Davis Jr. in particular for his availability as a resource to NAFCU and all credit unions. To reduce budgetary pressure, NAFCU recommends the agency explore additional opportunities to leverage existing cybersecurity expertise from other regulators through the FFIEC. Utilizing such resources or finding new ways to collaborate with fellow regulators could help eliminate overlap and knowledge gaps within the agencies that may be hard to fill. To the extent that the agency may be contemplating the pursuit of additional exam powers through legislative changes, we believe the industry deserves greater transparency regarding the budgetary impact of such a proposal, regardless of the merits. Finally, NAFCU thanks the Ncua for its continuing commitment to financial inclusion and supports the mission of Ncua's New Access Initiative. Chairman Hood's unyielding focus on financial inclusion has proven to be critically important during this difficult economic time. NAFCU is optimistic about the Access Initiative helping to close the gap that leaves many communities unserved and underserved. To that end, the Ncua's Office of Credit Union Resources and Expansion must be well funded to ensure it has the ability to support low-income designated credit unions, minority credit unions, and any credit union seeking to expand its field of membership or to pursue these designations. Approving pending field of membership expansions and considering additional methods for modernizing the agency's field of membership requirements are critical to expanding credit unions' reach to the populations that need them most. NAFCU urges the Ncua to commit to pursuing these goals by guaranteeing that CURE be sufficiently funded to undertake them. Today's briefing highlights the agency's commitment to improving budget transparency and stakeholder engagement, which is of utmost importance considering the current economic circumstances. Although NAFCU has made several recommendations for ways to improve the efficiency of the agency's budget, the importance of this opportunity to provide recommendations in a public forum should be underscored, as it is essential to ensuring a strong, growing credit union system. NAFCU applauds Chairman Hood and Board Member Harper, as well as the hard work of the Ncua staff in preparing this budget justification and other budget materials for today's hearing. NAFCU values the Ncua's day-to-day commitment to the stewardship of credit union member funds and looks forward to continuing the conversation regarding the agency's budget. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and this concludes my remarks.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Long. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Ms. Ito from NASCUS. Good morning, Ms. Ito.
Good morning, Chairman Hood, and good morning, Board Member Harper. I am really going to try to make my remarks as short as possible, so apologies for just blasting through. First of all, I do want to acknowledge that NASCUS appreciates the public briefing that you are holding on the budget. This does reflect the board's commitment to transparency, accountability, and giving stakeholders a voice in Ncua's budgeting process. Regarding Ncua's budget, as you know, NASCUS historically has held the position that a regulatory agency, whether it's state or federal, is in the best position to identify the resources it needs to maintain a safe and sound supervisory system. So we will not comment on specific budget line items, but no surprise to you, we do have observations to share with you with respect to the 2021 overhead transfer rate. In the interest of time, I'm going to begin by summarizing our recommendations and then follow with our rationale for these recommendations. We are now all familiar with the 2017 methodology, which has 4 principles. Principle 1 is that Ncua time spent examining and supervising federal credit unions is allocated to the Share Insurance Fund at 50%. We suggest 37%. For Principle 2, Ncua supervises and evaluates the risk posed by federally insured state chartered credit unions and then other entities that Ncua does not charter or regulate, such as third-party vendors and QSOs. At the moment, this is 100%, and we do agree that it makes sense 100% for federally insured state chartered credit unions. However, the second part of that, relating to QSOs and third-party vendors, we believe that a 50 to 75% allocation is more appropriate. We don't have any recommendations with respect to Principle 3 or Principle 4, but we wonder if a new 5th principle is appropriate for capital budget expenses. We are proposing to move those into the share insurance fund, and the allocation that has been suggested or used accords with the overall overhead transfer rate. We would suggest perhaps an amount of less than 25%, which I'll discuss more. A couple other recommendations. We would like to ask Ncua to include a step in its budgeting process, particularly the OTR calculation, in asking state agencies to validate Ncua's workload estimates. And then secondly, we would like to see a reconciliation of your allocation assumptions and actual time allocations. We realize that the recommendations that I've just summarized here cannot possibly be implemented for the 2021 budget, but I do hope that the Ncua board will consider our observations in preparing future budgets. And of course, we stand ready to work with Ncua board and staff in the spirit of cooperation and interdependency between Ncua and SSAs. In terms of our rationale for these recommendations, let me just make a few notes about what we see as imbalance and potential inequity resulting from OTR implementation. The OTR is significant because federally insured state-chartered credit unions shoulder the cost of an inordinate cost of supervising the safety and soundness of the broader credit union system. Just as federal credit unions pay Ncua an operating fee, state credit unions pay their state regulator an operating fee. We estimate that state chartered credit unions pay $100 to $125 million to their state agencies. Now, I threw out a 37% number as a possible alternative to the 50% that Ncua currently allocates to the overhead transfer rate. The reason is for that is by sheer number of individual credit unions, federally insured credit unions make up only 37% of the total number of federally insured credit unions. However, since state charters make up 50% of insured shares, the cost of the OTR is borne equally from the funds of both federal and borne equally from both state chartered credit unions and federal credit unions, even though there are more federal credit unions whose examination costs are being charged to the NCUSIF. Put another way, federally insured state charters pay 50% of the share insurance fund's costs, but represent only 37% of Ncua's insurance-related work. Now, both federal and state chartered credit unions contribute to the NCUSIF and bear the burden of the OTR. However, the federal credit union burden is less because when the OTR goes up, the federal credit union operating fee goes down. This inequitable effect on state versus federal credit unions is a primary reason why the OTR methodology is so important to the state system. When the current methodology was introduced in 2017, we recognized that it was a huge improvement, albeit an imperfect improvement, and in particular, we note the allocation of 50% of federal credit union exam time as insurance-related. That, we said, was a very sensible compromise at that time. And though we agree that the share insurance fund should cover appropriate expenses, as more Ncua annual budget expenditure categories are allocated to the share insurance fund, the 2017 compromise becomes less tenable for the state system. Moving now to our ask that Ncua revisit the cost allocation of Ncua's supervision of QSOs and third parties. I noted before this is under Principle 2. We agree that 100% of the I stated that already, let me try to shorten this. State credit union regulators and the OCC are chartering authorities and do not administer deposit or share insurance funds. Yet they have robust safety and soundness programs, including monitoring risks posed by third-party vendors. As the chartering authority of federal credit unions, Ncua would consider a review of third-party vendors as necessary and inherently related to their exam process, even in the absence of Ncua's insurance role. And certainly, given Ncua's interest in obtaining direct supervisory authority over third-party vendors, which NASCA supports, ensuring equitable allocation of associated expenses will become more and more essential. Let me move now to the treatment of capital expenditures and miscellaneous revenue. We agree with Ncua that the Share Insurance Fund should bear the capital budget costs of its operations. However, while the allocation of the capital budget pursuant to the 4 OTR principles might be convenient, it may not be equitable as the percentages are currently defined for the methodology. In the 2021 Budget Justification, Ncua states that, quote, by applying the 4 principles in a manner that incorporates all operating and capital budget activities, the OTR for 2021 is estimated to be 62.3%, the same result as applying the 4 principles to the operating budget alone. This strikes us as a circular statement rather than a convincing explanation for why the same allocation should apply to the capital budget as applies to the operating budget. Given increasing state agency assumption of computer and other capital costs, it would seem that the Share Insurance Fund should carry a much smaller percentage of Ncua's computer, software, and other capital charges than Ncua allocates to its role as the Federal Credit Union Chartering Authority. We look forward to dialoguing with Ncua on what an appropriate allocation would be. Last rationale that I would like to provide is regarding the validation and reconciliation of allocation assumptions and actual time allocations. We understand that the OTR goes up and down from year to year. It's natural that it would, but we still struggle to identify precisely what factors cause the fluctuations. The 2021 Budget Justification notes that the primary driver in this year's, or 2021's increase is an increase in exam and supervision time for federally insured credit unions. Also, the justification notes that field level reviews form the basis for estimating workload hours and that regional managers refine workload estimates. We would recommend that SSAs validate Ncua's time allocation assumptions, and we noted, I think, in last year's budget briefing that we would very much welcome the opportunity to sit with Ncua and understand how Ncua reconciles the budgetary overhead transfer rate with actual time allocations. So we will look forward to that. I do have a couple of closing thoughts. First of all, the significance of the OTR is even greater in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated economic downturn. Every dollar removed from the Share Insurance Fund is one less dollar available to cover credit union losses to the fund. The 1% increase in the 2021 OTR means that there will be up to $3.3 million less available to cover losses to the fund. Let me now say that we really do appreciate these public budget briefings. NASCA is grateful. And now that a number have been held in consecutive years, we're very interested in viewing what recommendations have been heeded from one year's briefing to the next year's budget. We believe that Ncua is genuine in gathering perspectives to improve its budgeting process, but we cannot honestly say that we're able to identify the suggestions that have been taken up over the last few years. NASCA is partly to blame in not reaching out to Ncua staff early enough in the next budget cycle to influence significant changes from one year to the next. And we do endeavor to work with you sooner rather than later for the next budget. Lastly, I do want to thank you both for your commitment to working with state regulators in an interdependent relationship. Chairman Hood, we do thank you for recommitting to the document of cooperation in 2019, and we hold the document of cooperation as one of our most valued agreements, so thank you for that. Board Member Harper, You have an insatiable and welcome interest in state approaches to supervision. Thank you for that, and we continue to look forward to working with you and state regulators together. And very gracious of both of you to recognize former board member Mcwaters in his contributions to the agency and the credit union system. We also would like to express our thanks to him, and in particular for driving the reform to the overhead transfer rate that took place in 2017. Chairman Hood, Board Member Harper, that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ito. And I'd like to just once again thank all of our presenters this morning, Mr. Schenck, Mr. Long, and Ms. Ito. You gave us all very thoughtful and insightful comments about our budget and our process, and also giving us room for improvement. And do know that a lot of your aforementioned suggestions will be taken and considered very seriously. With that being said, I now would like to turn the floor over for questions from the board. Mr. Schenck, this one is going to be to you, sir. Can you please elaborate on your concerns of consumer protection examination activity in the credit union system? Mr. Schenck, you may be on mute if you're responding.
Sorry about that. I think the essential point is that we believe that the agency has the tools in place now to identify any dislocations or concerns with those issues, and within the current context of prudential examination can take care of those concerns.
Thank you. I would just add, recognizing that Ncua resources come directly from our credit unions, we as an agency should take great care when directing the agency's limited resources to open-ended new commitments. And we should seek to avoid new compliance requirements without fully considering their impact on credit unions and their budgets. Additionally, the commitment to consumer financial protection is not new to the Ncua. In fact, it goes hand in hand with our safety and soundness mission. Before we consider additional layers of oversight, I think it's important to note existing Ncua consumer compliance practices. It is imperative that we strive to keep a healthy balance between the appropriate level of oversight needed to ensure consumers are protected and the flexibility credit unions need to provide the highest levels of service to their member owners. To understand why, it's worth considering the substantial level of resources the Ncua already has dedicated to consumer protection. The agency's Office of Consumer Financial Protection has 25 dedicated staff members who provide critical oversight and leadership in this arena. In addition, the Ncua's Consumer Assistance Center provides an avenue through which credit union members can report concerns they may have about their treatment at their credit unions. We take these complaints very seriously and follow through on each and every one of them with the aim of resolving them to each member's satisfaction. When it comes to working with credit unions, our goal is to facilitate their safe and sound operation while ensuring they fully comply with applicable laws. Toward that end, we emphasize a compliance approach over an enforcement approach, providing credit unions with clear guidelines and incentives to ensure they prioritize consumer protection. When a compliance issue does arise, as is inevitable, we strive to detect and resolve problems in credit unions before they become insurmountable. Please note, though, I would be willing to create a CFPB-like program at the Ncua if the CFPB returns credit union supervision back to the agency fully, something that our General Counsel has opined is permissible for the CFPB to do under existing law. We can all agree that consumer financial protection is vitally important, and while I have my views, I certainly look forward to working with my board peers as we consider this issue further before the final budget vote. I'd now like to pose a question to Mr. Long. Can you please elaborate on your support of Ncua's Access Initiative?
Yes, Chairman Hood, thank you for the question. I think, at NAFCU, we're certainly watching some of the communities that have been hardest hit during the pandemic, unserved and underserved communities. We just released a report yesterday outlining some of our findings and the good work that credit unions are doing in those communities. Of course, we would like to see some additional legislative freedoms in that area. But also, we think that, the Access Initiative kind of generally points in the direction of expanding credit unions' field and membership authorities, and we sincerely believe that where credit unions are allowed to expand, the communities that they go into are better served because of it.
Thank you. And I do have one final question for Ms. Ito. Ms. Ito, I was delighted that we were able to work together in signing that document of cooperation last year in San Francisco. And I'd love to get your impression to date on how are our efforts going as we all work in tandem with you all in keeping our credit union system safe and sound. And then also, are there any suggestions for improvement that you'd like to see us consider for future engagement?
Thank you so much, Chairman Hood. I do think that the relationship between Ncua, NASCUS, and state agencies is excellent. It's been fantastic seeing the work that we're doing together as we grapple with the current pandemic. Right now, NASCUS holds biweekly meetings with state agencies, and every other meeting Ncua staff participates. So that's been fantastic, as well as has been the joint working group between Ncua and state agencies. We are, going forward, you asked about any recommendations, and a new working group that was started this year, and we appreciate that, is the SSA Capital Working Group. We've had a couple calls with Ncua staff to compare notes on capital issues, but looking to 2021 and 2022, when the risk-based capital rule is slated to go into effect. I'm certainly meeting more frequently with Ncua on capital issues. I think would be very good to make sure that we're aligned and on the same page so that credit unions get a consistent message from both their federal examiners and their state examiners. Thank you, Chairman Hood.
Great, thank you. And to our panelists, that concludes my questions. I'd now like to recognize Board Member Harper. Board Member Harper, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mike, Kurt, and Lucy, for your presentations today and for your written statements. I have read them all, and I have several questions. Kurt and Mike, let me start with you. While we can always achieve further operational and staffing efficiencies, I have apprehensions about whether we can be a prudent steward for the credit union system if we cut too deep. At the start of this century, we saw a steady decline in the cost per $1 million insured at the Ncua. This figure bottomed out in 2008 at $210. That cutting of fat actually cut to the bone and left the agency flat-footed and ill-prepared for the financial crisis. To play catch-up, the agency's budget spiked in the following 3 years, with annual increases exceeding 10% at a time when the credit union balance sheets remained quite stressed. That is why I believe in the principle of preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. The draft budget notes, if the current consolidation trends persist, there will be fewer credit unions in operation in future years, and those that remain will be considerably larger and more complex. As of June 30, 2020, there were 627 federally insured credit unions with assets of at least $500 million, 34% more than just 5 years earlier. These 627 credit unions accounted for 76% of credit union members and 81% of credit union assets. Large credit unions tend to offer more complex products. Increasingly complex institutions will pose management challenges for the institutions themselves as well as the Ncua. Consolidation means that the risks posed by individual institutions will also become more significant to the Share Insurance Fund. Considering the NCUA holistically examines and supervises credit unions, assets, operations, and management, and with a sizable increase in more complex institutions, what more can the agency do to prepare for the credit union system? Mike, you can go first.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the strategic plan very clearly foresees a world where technology can play a large role in keeping costs down. And while you're right that there are more larger complex institutions, it's also true that a big chunk of the budget has something to do with travel. And when you have fewer institutions, there's less travel involved. But I think the combination of the application of technology, and you seem to be on the right track with that, the application of technology and the fact that there are just fewer institutions being supervised in combination can play a pretty big role in sort of addressing those concerns. I don't, the other part of it, of course, is, when we look back at the Great Recession and you think about what happened there, I don't think there was anybody that was really prepared for the Great Recession or the financial crisis that led to the Great Recession. And in some respects, the cost of being prepared for that would have, arguably, greatly outstripped the benefit of being prepared. I mean, the cost of being prepared for any eventual crisis essentially means that, in our case, credit union members receive fewer benefits. Fewer people can be helped. So I think that comes into play as well. And I also think it's important to point out that while we are in the middle of a significant crisis, and we do agree that there's a lot to be concerned about, we agree that risks may be increasing in the near future. We're very concerned, for example, about the idea of, at the moment, an absence of additional fiscal stimulus. So those things are certainly things that we think about. At the same time, I do think it's important to point out that even though we're being stressed, credit unions remain in a very solid financial position. We have ample liquidity. We're essentially near record highs on asset quality with solid earnings, very healthy capital levels that have only come down because of the deposits, or I should say in large part because of the federal stimulus deposits, not because there were significant financial dislocations. I think that, in combination with the idea that, at the last board meeting, we saw, Camel Code 1 and 2 credit unions are actually increasing. 3s, 4s, 5s are declining in numbers. And so far, in the middle of this crisis, there's been one failure with less than 2 million in total losses. So, at the moment, I don't see the need. And then looking into the future, because the strategic plan seems to align with this idea that we can do more with technology, that those things really are impactful.
Thank you, Mike, for that answer. I have to somewhat disagree with your analysis. I view the Ncua in part being the firefighters, the ones who come in and protect. And certainly we should not undercut the number of institutions or the number of examiners that we have, because we need to be prepared in order to step up. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be considering a certain cost, but we need to be prepared. And with respect to your analysis about the Camel Code ratings actually improving, what we know about Camel Codes is it's a lagging indicator. It doesn't actually indicate risk in advance. Because it's a lagging indicator, we're not going to see Camel Code rating downgrades now for another several quarters. So using that indicator as the basis of your analysis, saying, well, credit unions are doing fine, isn't really truly representing the true picture. Kurt, let's turn to you. Considering the Ncua holistically examines and supervises credit unions, and with a sizable increase in more complex institutions, what more can the agency do to prepare the credit union system?
Well, sure. Thank you, Board Member Harper, for the question. I think, you know, I have some of the same thoughts that Mike mentioned, so I'll try not to repeat them. But I think, you know, if I think about this sort of abstractly, I mean, you can think about a situation where all credit union industry assets were under one shop, and there are several banks that are larger than all consolidated industry assets among credit unions. Would that really require an operating budget of the size that Ncua currently has to supervise that institution? I would think not. So, you know, we recognize the complexity issue, but there also needs to be consideration, just the fact of the smaller number of institutions to supervise. The second thing I'd say is that, you know, one facet of our comments was not just the level of Ncua's budget, but the fact that expenses excluding travel have been accelerating in recent years. And so that's something that I think, sort of in line with a lot of our comments about sort of the cost-benefit analysis, that the agency could do a better job of explaining what the benefits of each of its initiatives are, and lining those up against the costs, clearly showing that they are warranted.
Thank you. Lucy, you're representing the state regulators today at this table. Is it prudent to approach exams, supervision, and compliance holistically?
I'm sorry, you cut out, Board Member Harper. Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. You're representing the state regulators today here at the table. Is it prudent to approach exams, supervision, and compliance holistically?
Okay, thank you very much. I understand your question. Well, in fact, I would say that that's how state agencies, by and large, do approach examination. For example, the latest survey that we did of state agencies on whether or not they included compliance as part of their exam process, we have 34 out of 45 states who do that. That does not necessarily mean that they assign a consumer compliance rating, but it is included in their examination process or supervision process.
Thank you, Lucy. You actually anticipated a question that I'll get to in a little bit later. Kurt, I want to turn back to you. From historical data, we know that when a federally insured credit union fails, it typically costs the share insurance fund about 20% of the liquidated credit union's assets. So the failure of a $500 million credit union would lead to a $100 million loss for the share insurance fund on average. Kurt, you spoke earlier about benefit cost analysis. Which is the better, more prudent approach? Spending an additional $10 million to $35 million on examinations, supervision, and compliance to support the resolution of credit union problems now, or paying $100 million in losses to the share insurance fund later?
Well, I think the right framework for analyzing that question would be to ask yourself what the benefit is of adding those examination costs. That is, what odds does the institution have of failing, without those costs versus with those costs?
But wouldn't you agree that it is better to spend $10 million than it is to cost the fund? If we knew with 100% certainty that the credit union was going to fail and that it was going to cause $100 million in losses, wouldn't it be more prudent to spend that $10 million up front?
Yes, in the scenario that you described, if the difference between not spending that $10 million means that they're definitely going to fail versus if you are going to spend the $10 million means that they will definitely not fail, then you're correct. It would be better to spend that money.
And I think it's important to remember that during the last financial crisis, we had 14 credit unions each with more than $1 billion in assets that were at a high risk of failure. They were Camel Code 4 or 5 institutions. We were ultimately able to nurse those institutions back to health. That required some increased resources at the time, and I think that was money well spent, because if any one of those institutions had failed, it wouldn't just be a $100 million loss. It would have been a $200 million or more loss, depending on the institution. Mike, I'd like to turn back to you. In your statement, you noted, quote, "We have real concerns around any obvious expansion in consumer protection examination activity. Our members believe altering the agency's risk-focused examination process and substantially increasing examination-related expenditures is simply not warranted," unquote. Most credit unions talk about safety and soundness as the key to their members' well-being. Mike, doesn't consumer financial protection also equate with member well-being? Why should a consumer receive a lower level of protection at a credit union than at a bank?
Well, we don't think that that members deserve a lower level of protection. What we think is that there's tremendous power in cooperative finance, and there's a tremendous power in the structural difference of credit unions relative to banks. So we don't think that credit unions are necessarily perfect. That's certainly not the case. But it does matter that the owners of these institutions are members. And, that prevents credit unions, generally speaking, on the margin, from engaging in most of the nefarious and really obvious behaviors that you see in the for-profit sector. So that, from our vantage point, seems to be a pretty healthy backstop. And again, we do also believe that the tools to uncover, the exceptions to that are in place. And so another layer with more expenses, again, doesn't seem warranted. And it's not like we as a trade association make this stuff up. This is what our members are telling us.
So I agree with you that credit unions are not perfect, Mike. I know of stories of credit unions that have repossessed the cars of active duty members. I know of stories of credit unions that have charged their lower income members excessively high overdraft and repeated overdraft fees, while then turning around and giving discounted jumbo mortgages to executives that work at the very same firm. I know of credit unions that have actually garnished economic impact payments that were paid to help paid out by the federal government to help people get through the crisis, even though those debts had been written off long ago. To me, we need to be doing more. As we have been conducting analysis within the credit union system on our current consumer financial protection program, we have found that there have been a substantial number of violations that we have identified. I am a firm believer that if you don't measure it, you can't manage to it. And if we are not helping credit unions to understand some of the issues, we're not doing our job effectively because we're not helping them to figure out where there might be shortfalls in their consumer compliance programs. Lucy, I want to close with you, and I have two more topics to explore. And let's continue to focus on consumer financial protection. For more than 3 decades, the Ncua has focused its examination program primarily on safety and soundness reviews. This policy worked well when the Ncua oversaw a large number of small credit unions serving a limited field of membership with only a few basic financial products. But today's credit unions are larger and more complex. The Ncua's current compliance examinations covering consumer financial protection laws in credit unions with total assets of $10 billion or less differs from other federal financial institutions regulators. Other regulators regularly complete scheduled risk-focused consumer compliance reviews and assign a separate consumer compliance rating outside of the CAMEL process for institutions under their jurisdiction. Lucy, are there states that examine their credit unions for compliance with consumer financial protection laws and assign a consumer compliance score separate and apart from the CAMEL ratings?
Board Member Harper, I am aware of 5 states where a separate rating is given. But as I mentioned in my earlier response to your question about taking a holistic approach, we do know that 34 states do include compliance review in their programs. Just I've only been able to verify 5 states that actually give a rating.
That's great, and that's really helpful information to have. My last question for you, Lucy, is the economic news throughout much of this year has been quite sobering. The precautions needed to combat the spread of COVID-19 caused economic activity to plummet and layoffs to surge. Lucy, are state regulators seeing a rise in higher risk credit unions this year? And if so, what scenarios are they preparing for next year in terms of budgets and resources?
Thank you, Board Member Harper. What we're hearing from states is that in 2020, credit unions are actually looking very resilient. Where states are very, very concerned, though, is what's going to happen in 2021. So they are, that really is, they're anxiously awaiting our move into 2021 so we can really get a better handle on the impact of the pandemic and the economic dislocation. They are concerned about concentration risk, and as has been noted in the discussion today, for certain types of credit unions whose field of membership has been particularly hard hit. And also looking at how forbearance measures are going to be treated. There's a concern about having consistency across different regulators, so not just between Ncua and state agencies, but across to the other federal banking agencies as well. And that's a big unknown.
And I agree with you, Lucy. I will agree that as a whole, federally insured credit unions have been resilient, although we've seen a dramatic drop in a number of the metrics, whether that be in net worth ratios, which credit unions are still well capitalized, or perhaps loan to share ratios, and even the return on average assets. And I, like what you just pointed out with state regulators, have some apprehensions about what's going to happen next year as the economic impact of COVID-19 truly unfolds. Finally, Lucy, in the past, Ncua has stepped in to support some states with additional examiner resources during economic downturns. Do you perceive the need for the Ncua to step in again in the near future?
We will know in 2021, but we do acknowledge that in the past, Ncua has assisted states when there was a local situation that required some help from Ncua. We're grateful for that, and it could be next year. Right now, we don't have any states that are on our emergency list at the moment. Certainly, a few states have been told that even though they're not funded by tax dollars, that across the board, all state agencies have to cut their budgets by X%. Sure. But so far, our agencies are telling us that they're able to proceed. So, it could be necessary next year, but fortunately right now we feel good about things. Certainly there will be budget and time constraints, but right now we think states are in good shape despite the pressures that they're facing.
Lucy, that's really good to know. And as you know, I view our state partners who are on the front lines of working to protect state-chartered credit unions, really, truly as partners. And if there's a need for more resources, we can work together in order to work to make sure we're doing the best for the federally insured credit union system. Again, thank you, Lucy, for your answer, as well as for your observations, Mike and Kurt. Mr. Chairman, I have no further comments or questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. And again, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today, Mike Schenck from CUNA, Kurt Long from NAFCU, and Lucy Ito from NASCUS. Thank you all for your commentary, for your insight, and for your written comments. And again, we will take all of your comments and letters quite seriously as we deliberate on our upcoming budget process. I'd also like to, for the good of the group assembled today, let you all know that Kyle Hoffman's nomination vote is proceeding as we now speak, and we expect him to be confirmed within the top of the next hour. And upon doing so, I will reach out, offer congratulations, and we will look forward to getting him sworn in as quickly as possible. With that being said, this adjourns our meeting today. Thank you all and have a wonderful holiday season. I remind you all that I look forward to joining you all at the December board meeting as well. Goodbye. This meeting is adjourned.